can you imagine it would have been when Nancy Astor walked into Parliament for the first time? I mean, you've all experienced the kind of that feeling of being the first or the only or one of the few. What do you imagine it would have been like for her?
I think it must have been very tough, and I think she was very brave, because I think for anybody, when there's an atmosphere around you and that atmosphere is hostile rather than friendly, it's off-putting. It's not easy. You have to kind of steel yourself, and I'm sure she had to.
And have you, in your life, felt those moments as a woman?
To give you one concrete example, I was just talking to Saida about when I went to the Foreign Office, a colleague who I'd worked with before, a woman in the Foreign Office, said to me quietly, "You do realise that there are people in the Foreign Office who don't think a woman should be Foreign Secretary," which I must admit I thought that by then they might have got over. But anyway, and she was right. But, you know, I regarded it as their problem rather than mine.
It's amazing, isn't it? 100 years, Anne. She was a trailblazer for all of you and for many more female MPs, I'm sure, that will come. And you hear Margaret talking there about what she faced. To understand what Nancy Astor must have gone through just to even take that step into Parliament and take that place is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, but if you go into politics, you know that you're not going into a Sunday school tea party. You're going to a place where there will be hostility. And I'm going to say, to get it in very quickly, I do not care how many women there are in Parliament. All I care about is the quality of those women. And I'd rather have a few who are Nancy Astor types than a vast quantity who are not.
But you'd say that about all politicians. You want the best of the best, regardless of gender.
Regardless of gender, exactly.
But Baroness Warsi, you were the first Muslim woman in cabinet, weren't you? I mean, there are still firsts, aren't there? And you would have thought maybe 100 years ago, we would have thought, hang on, in 100 years this time, we won't be having any firsts. It will have all happened.
Yeah, that's true.
And what was it like for you?
I think because I didn't come from the world of politics, that one of the ways that I suppose, survived was not knowing the rules. At a very early stage, I kind of thought I can either feel the burden and the pressure of this and try and fit in and conform, or I can say,
what kind of rules do you mean that you would have been expected to follow that you chose not to?
I think there were all sorts of expectations about what you should have known, what your background was, how you kind of came to conversations. There were lots of times when I would be stood around listening to a conversation, not having the faintest idea what these people were talking about. And so I remember thinking I can either try and, pretend or fake it or feel kind of, blag it, or I can say, you know what, I'm a working class girl from Yorkshire and hey, I've made it to the cabinet table. I'm going to enjoy this and I'm going to do it my way and I'm going to be as authentic as I can be. And if that means that I'm going to upset a few people, and I did upset enough people, both in Cabinet and in the House of Lords. And of course, for me, when I joined the House of Lords, I was 36. I was the youngest member of the House of Lords. And there was certainly chuntering about who was this upstart who'd arrived and didn't quite fit, the kind of idea of what we thought of front bench.
Has that changed? Do you think that's changed? Do you think there's less of that going on?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's changed in so many ways. I mean, I've now been in the House of Lords for 12 years, and the number of young people who've come through since then, and we have more women now. I mean, the percentage is increasing painfully slowly, so I think it's gone from about 22 to 23 to 20.
But it matters to you, does it? I mean, rather than... we've got Edwina Currie, haven't we, down the line? Let's bring in Edwina as well.
Good morning,
hello.
Edwina.
Oh, there you are. Hello. Looking very Christmassy. I mean, does it matter to you about how many women there are, just in terms of representation, in terms of, young girls watching who might think, yes, I could be in politics? Is it important for women to get to the top in politics, for all of us?
Well, I think it's important for the House of Commons to represent and to look like it represents the people of the country as a whole. So we still haven't quite got up to that level. And indeed, as an older woman, I might prefer to see more older women in there. But if I could just comment on something we've just heard, I found it a great advantage being a woman in the House of Commons back in the days when there were only a handful of us, which Margaret Beckett will remember as well. We were much more visible. I think we got a lot more attention than an equivalent man might have done. We got a lot more attention for the things that we wanted to say and wanted to do. I think that was helpful.
Christine, both you and Anne nodding along. And also you were nodding along when Baroness Warsi was talking about sort of being on the edge of a conversation and not really knowing what was being spoken about.
I don't actually agree that it was an advantage for there to be fewer women. It might have made the women who were there visible, but it didn't actually send the right message to the country. It still looked like a boys' club.
Right.
And I remember watching television in those days, and it did look very much like, you know, grey-suited men everywhere. It's very different nowadays. We've got a female party leader, we've had 2 female prime ministers. Very nearly had
Scottish women reach it.
A lot of
Scottish
women.
Davidson, who else now isn't there?
Working-class Scottish women
Joe
don't like being
Swinson,
told
Nicola
no.
Sturgeon. It's fascinating, though, that, you know, that sort of Scottish spirit, sort of, in women, certainly. It seems to come into the fore.
The big advantage, sorry.
No, that's OK.
The seriously big advantage was that because at that time both major parties were trying desperately to promote women, we were actually competing in a smaller pool. And there was a real advantage there. And anybody who says, you know, that women were at a disadvantage at that time, unless you were pretty hopeless, you were not at a disadvantage at that time.
And Tulip, you've got a pretty extraordinary story, haven't you, about your pregnancy and how you managed that around your parliamentary duties, which, you know, is a real issue for women, isn't it?
Well, I was just complaining to Ben that my child kept me up all night because he's not well, and then wanted to discuss election strategy at 5 a.m.
Your child?
Well, my 10-month-old. Full of beans.
He's a good sounding board, isn't he?
I think for me, the main
Just explain what happened, actually, for those who don't know about your cesarean.
So I was having a baby. It happened to happen exactly at the same time there was a major vote going through Parliament. And I kept thinking to myself, what if I was having my C-section and the Brexit deal went through by 1 vote? I kept thinking that. So I said to my doctor, would it be possible to delay my C-section by a day? And he said, well, I'm a Remainer, so yes, OK.
Oh, my word.
So I did that. But you can imagine, I mean, I didn't do that on a whim. I thought about it long and hard. And I discussed it with my husband, I discussed it with my family. And I had lost trust in the pairing system because of what had happened to Joe Swinson. So I just thought, OK, this is worth it. So I delayed the birth of my child so that we could have a closer relationship with Europe. I had had steroid injections, which is why I was finding it very difficult to walk, because I was having the child slightly early. Long story, gestational diabetes and all of that, which we've already discussed today, haven't we? Yeah. When you get a bunch of women together, we end up discussing pregnancy and gestational diabetes. No.
Not all of them.
It is worth pointing out that the men also have those dilemmas. I can remember during the Maastricht debate, some of the men coming in on stretchers being brought in, you know, giving up timed operations in hospitals. Margaret's nodding. We can all remember it. It's not just the women.
But we are celebrating women in Parliament today, so that's why we're allowed to.
Can I just say that one of the other things about that evening was that we had just spent a year trying to get proxy voting through.
That's right.
Specifically for not just women who have just given birth or who are pregnant, but for men whose partners, and for women whose partners have just given birth. And it had been blocked and blocked and blocked. Even although we'd agreed it just wasn't happening. And Tulip doing what she did, actually, everybody was horrified when they saw you sitting there in Parliament. And it was like, really, we need to get this done. And I think that's one of the most significant things for women that happened in the last Parliament.
And I'll just say, I do agree with you that we're not unique in every way, but we are unique in being able to give birth, I think. That's fair to say.
No, your situation was not just that you were giving birth, it was that you needed a medical appointment immediately, and men are in the same position. And what I really think, and just let me say this, I do think it's so important that women don't always sound as if they've got a massive grievance. I was delighted to get into Parliament. I got there without any of this help about all-women shortlists and all the rest of it. So did Mrs Thatcher, so did Edwina Currie, so did Margaret. We got there and we felt as we came in through those doors, we were on exact equality with the men.
And, you know, I agree with that, but I also think that true equality comes when women can be as mediocre as men and still be successful in politics. And that's going to be the point, because, you know, women have to be exceptional to get to these places, and men can sometimes be pretty non-exceptional.
Let's go back to Edwina as well, because I'm sure you want to join in, because sadly you can't be here in the studio, because I'd imagine that there were some challenges that you've, I mean, as strong and as focused and as confident as you were going into the House of Commons and becoming an MP, I'm sure there were challenges that you faced that perhaps you hadn't planned for, that hopefully the women going in these days won't be facing.
Well, I think the biggest challenge, and the one we haven't heard anything about, is actually looking after your constituents. You go into the House of Commons and you think you're the big I am. You go to the Advice Bureau on a Friday evening or a Saturday morning and you're faced with all sorts of issues, most of which you have never experienced. And you've got to try and help these people. And that's why I object a little bit to the idea that women MPs are victims or in some ways weaker characters or weaker sex or anything like that.
I mean, that is absolutely quantifiable, that women MPs these days, perhaps, you know, in your generation when you were going in, social media wasn't a thing, and actually women going in now are, you know, there are threats made to their children. I was sat down with Jo Swinson. She said in the House of Commons that there'd been a specific threat made to her. Of course, that could have happened to a man too, but we know, and there are so many women having left this year politics. Does that concern you in general? Does it concern you, Edwina, that women seem to be leaving politics?
Yeah, I don't buy into that. There are actually more men that have left politics, and they tend to have been serving a lot longer. We were at risk, serious risk, from the IRA during the time that I was in politics there. 5 colleagues, 5 members of Parliament were murdered by the IRA. We were all at risk the whole time. If you're a public figure like that, you are going to be subject to a lot of intimidation and sometimes to threats. You always have to look after yourself, and you always have to be really putting other people first. That's what a job of an MP is.
Go on, you can talk to her. Just a point Edwina made there about, you know, we're saying that, you know, there's something wrong, that it's terribly difficult for us being women in politics. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that Parliament has to reflect and set an example. And if it's all men, then that's not setting the right example. We feel, I'm sure I can speak for all of us, intensely privileged to be there and to have the honour of serving those constituents who come to us with problems. But at the same time, Parliament has to look like the country. And until there's a 50-50 split and there's more diversity in Parliament, then people have a right to demand that their Parliament
Can you see that happening, Margaret, 50-50 split?
Yeah. Well, I can see it happening, but I would say, with great respect to Anne, I take her point entirely, that Margaret Thatcher and Anne herself, we were fortunate enough to make it into the House of Commons without extra help and support. Without that extra support, extra opportunity or whatever, we will never get to 50%. We tried everything we could think of before we tried all women shortlists, and we worked out we were making progress, a lot of progress. But it would take us 250 years to get to parity. We thought that was too long.
I'm just going to come in about intersectionality, because I think, obviously, we can get more women in, but we also have to look at where the women are coming from. Yeah. So what kind of class, what colour they are, what religion, did they go to university. So I think there is a lot to be said about that. And I also just want to make a point about Edwina Currie. And obviously, there was a lot of threat to women at the time. I wasn't around. But the scrutiny now and knowing where MPs are is very different because of social media. So I've been warned, because of some security threats I've had, not to tweet and say, I'm going to this event. Because chances are there might be someone waiting there who's threatening me in the past. Which is an MP, the whole point is to be accessible to your constituents and be able to say, come and meet me. So do you feel that it hinders your ability to do your job? I don't think it hinders it, because I don't let it hinder me, but there's no doubt there's been times when I've been warned and said, it's probably best you don't go to this event. And I've said, well, actually, do you know what? I was elected and I am going anyway. But there's no doubt that we are asked sometimes to be careful. And I'm sure that's probably right for most people on this panel.
Anne, anything else you'd like to add? We're nearly out of time.
Yes, very straightforwardly. Women get there on their own merits. That is the only basis on which they should get there. And I do not care how many women, ethnics, gays, old folks, young folks, ginger-headed folks or anybody else are there. Merit only should be the criterion.
OK.
I was going to come back on that.
It's being able to display that merit that counts.
And that's the point, because, you know, we all accept that women are as talented as men, and if they're not getting through, then there's something wrong in the system. There's nothing wrong with the women. And I think when we're celebrating, you know, women coming into Parliament 100 years ago, I think it's now right for us to say that there should be a completely level playing field, and therefore it should be purely on merit.
Playing field tilted towards us.
The system has to allow that to happen.
OK.
Tilted towards us with all women shortlisted.
We're going to have to leave it there. It feels like we've had a bit of a all-female cabinet here this morning.
I feel like Lucas wants all-female cabinet.
Yeah,
this could be it.
I feel like I'm in the way.